The Supreme Court has ordered the establishment of a 1 kilometer radius of eco-sensitive zones around all protected areas, national parks and wildlife sanctuaries across the country. The new guidelines by the Environment Ministry point out that these eco-sensitive zones are being declared in order to ensure that these zones act as a shock absorber in case of national parks, wildlife sanctuaries and other protected areas. In ExplainWallah by LearnStroke, today let's try to explore what these eco-sensitive zones are all about. A three-judge bench by Justices L. Nageshwara Rao, B. R. Gavai and Aniruddha Bose has pointed out that how the nation's natural resources has been indiscriminately exploited over the years by activities like mining. The directions of the court came on a bunch of applications filed in a pending petition by T. N. Godavarman, where the court is suo motu passing orders for the protection of natural resources. These proceedings originate from a public interest litigation that was instituted in 1995 for the protection of forest lands of Nilgiris in Tamil Nadu. Subsequently, the scope of the petition was enlarged to protect the natural resources throughout the country. Besides this, the court order also dealt with issues related to mining in and around the Jamua Ramgarh Wildlife Sanctuary in the state of Rajasthan. As per the National Wildlife Action Plan issued by the Union Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, land within 10 km of the boundaries of national park and wildlife sanctuaries will be notified as eco-fragile zones or eco-sensitive zones. Though the 10 km rule is implemented in principle, the extent of application may vary. Area beyond 10 km can also be notified by the government as an eco-sensitive zone if they hold greater ecologically sensitive corridors. In such areas, some activities are permitted, some others are regulated, while some are totally prohibited. First, let's try to examine what are the prohibited activities. Commercial mining, sawmills, establishment of large hydroelectric projects, and commercial use of wood is totally prohibited. Tourism activities such as hot air balloons over the national parks are also prohibited. More than that, solid waste discharge and effluents in any form and of hazardous substances are totally prohibited. As I said earlier, some activities are regulated. These include felling of trees, establishment of hotels and resorts, erection of electric cables, commercial use of natural water, and drastic change of agricultural practices. Unlike the prohibited and regulated activities, some activities are freely permitted. These include ongoing agricultural and horticultural activities, rainwater harvesting, organic farming, and adoption of green technology for all activities. So now let's try to examine what is the significance of eco-sensitive zones and why are these created. First and foremost, as mentioned earlier, eco-sensitive zones act as a shock absorbers in case of certain protected areas. These are created in order to ensure that the negative impact of human activities in surrounding areas are limited to a greater extent. Next is to minimize the impact of various developmental activities such as urbanization. These eco-sensitive zones in one way or the other insulate the protected areas from these developmental activities. Next is related to in situ conservation. I guess you all might be knowing what in situ conservation is all about. In situ conservation is nothing but the conservation of an endangered species in its natural habitat. For example, the conservation of one-horned rhino in Kaziranga National Park is a perfect example of in situ conservation. Yet another significance is related to minimizing the forest depletion and resolve human-animal conflicts. We all read in the newspapers issues related to human-animal conflict. But once an eco-sensitive zone is created, there is a minimum assurance that the local communities are adequately protected and they are benefited. So now let's try to examine what are the new guidelines related to eco-sensitive zone. As per the new guidelines, the eco-sensitive zones would act as a transition zone from areas that require high protection to those demanding lesser protection. In addition to that, no permanent structure can be created within these eco-sensitive zones. Mining cannot be permitted in national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. If the existing eco-sensitive zone goes beyond 1 kilometer and if some statutory instrument prescribes a higher limit, then such extended boundary will prevail. The Chief Conservator of Forests of each state has been directed to make a list of the subsisting structures, and the same list should be produced before the court within a 3-month period. The minimum width of the eco-sensitive zone may be diluted in case of overwhelming public interest. But in this case, what happens is that the concerned state or union territory should approach the court-appointed Central Empowered Committee and the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change for the purpose. Both these bodies, the Central Empowered Committee and MOEFCC, shall give their respective opinions on the issue, and based on this opinion, the court will arrive at an appropriate conclusion relating to the dilution of ESZ. The order will be applicable across the country. The Kaziranga National Park and Tiger Reserve is one among the handful of national parks in the country without a specified or declared eco-sensitive zone. I think by now we all have a clear understanding regarding what are eco-sensitive zones and what is its relevance. But some environmentalists and policy activists have vehemently criticized the recent Supreme Court order regarding the establishment of 1 kilometer eco-sensitive zone around protected areas. So what are the grounds of criticism? One major criticism raised against the court order is that the critics point out that the court order lacks a proper scientific basis and ignores topography as a whole, because there are mountains, oceans, grasslands and various other kinds of habitat. But the recent court order does not mention these separately, and the order has been issued as a whole. But the critics remind that each topography demands a different kind of treatment. They also added that eco-sensitive zones are to be declared on a case-to-case basis, and this requires a lot of participatory planning at various levels. There are criticisms from various other quarters too. As in case of Kerala, that is numerous national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, declaring a 1 kilometer eco-sensitive zone in each and every national park and wildlife sanctuary is likely to impact the human habitation and development in these areas at a massive scale. Last but definitely not the least, developmental activities in these areas are going to be hit beyond our imagination. Even basic rural and urban infrastructure like creation of dams and roads is likely to be affected. So I think now we have discussed eco-sensitive zones with a 360-degree perspective. Though the new order by Supreme Court has invited lot of criticism, one thing that we all need to keep in our mind is that development always needs to be sustainable. And whatever we can contribute for sustainable development, it is the responsibility of each and every individual. At the same time, human habitations and their survival, the local communities around these eco-sensitive zones, their life is at stake. So all we need to understand is that every life in this planet has a right to exist. So in this particular issue related to eco-sensitive zone, what should be done is that discussion at various levels should happen. And we should be able to arrive at a feasible conclusion, a feasible solution that does not harm man and that does not harm environment.